Good day, students. My name is Mr. Walker. We're here, we'll be having a physical education class today. The focus of today's lesson will be the history of football, more specifically, Jamaican football. So by the end of this class, I hope you will learn a lot more about the origin of our football, the stages it has been through, and some of our achievements on the way, along with a few of the players that have made Jamaican football what it is today. So, where did Jamaican football start? The actual date of introduction of football in Jamaica is somewhere around in the 1883. They said it was anywhere after 1880 to 1885. More specifically, historians have said it was in 1883. But there is no specific date or the person who brought it here. What we know is that Reverend G.C. Hendricks, he had a team from St. Anne. It was the York Castle 11. Back then, football did not have substitutes. So it was the 11. Whatever 11 started, that 11 needed to end the game. So that's the first orchestrated football team we know of in Jamaica. That was even before the birth of the Jamaica Football Association. Now, Association Football Cup. That is our very first organized tournament, the first recorded one that we have on our books. It took place in October 1906. Back then we did not have many teams, so football tournaments were very short, over a weekend or so, and an entire tournament would be completed. The former governor, Sir Sidney Oliver, and Sir William Manning donated trophies to be played for schoolboys. Hence we have the Manning Cup. That is our oldest football tournament that is continuing up to this date. We did not start having the Costa Cup football till 1949. So the football was predominantly played among corporate area schoolboys and corporate area clubs back then. For the most part, the game was located in the corporate area under the auspices of the Jamaica Football Association, which was founded in 1910. So we had football here from 1883, but it wasn't until 1910 we had an organized football association that ran the affairs of football in Jamaica. Back then, the focus was on the corporate areas. A lot of our football came from traveling soldiers who came from out of England who were stationed in the corporate area. So that is where our football was focused. So we had a lot of that back then. Of all the other parishes, only St. James had an organized team in the 1940s. It was called the St. James 11. So we see the two powerhouses in football in Jamaica, the corporate area and St. James. And it's not from today, it has always been from football came to Jamaica. These were the areas that had constructed football tournaments, constructed football teams, and so these are the areas that had greater development in the sport of football. As a country, Jamaica made its first international appearance against the Caribbean neighbors Haiti in 1925. Now back then, there were not many organized football teams within the region. So when we organized a football team, we played against Haiti many times. There were many back and forth between Jamaica and Haiti because other Caribbean islands didn't have an organized football team to play against. We started off all our initial games, we would beat Haiti on a regular basis. We played most of our home games back then were played at Sabina Park. Now, Haiti did not actually win a game against Jamaica until 1932. When we went there, they beat us 4-1. Our biggest victory back then was at Sabina Park. We gave them a 6-0 beating back then when we played Haiti at Sabina Park. Haiti being our regular rivals, we would meet those players. Back then, things were much easier. So after we started playing Haiti on a regular basis, we started having other teams come on board. So Trinidad and Tobago began to play football, Cuba and other clubs. Now, international football was not just among nations against nations. Oftentimes, clubs from some of the more dominant and prominent countries would travel. So we had clubs from Brazil coming here, we had clubs from Argentina coming here, and we had the Caribbean All-Star team. Now, the Caribbean All-Star team was formed when many of the smaller islands didn't have a team for themselves, so they came together and formed the Caribbean All-Star team. Now, because of our early footballing days, Jamaica wanted to be a part of the big picture. So Jamaica, we've always been an ambitious people. So it was from 1965 we made attempts to qualify for the World Cup. Back then we did very well for a small country, making the final round of qualification where only one team from CONCACAF would go. That team ended up being Mexico. That final round, it was Jamaica, Mexico, and Costa Rica, but we lost to our Central American rivals and we didn't make it to that final round where we would have played in the World Cup. Now, as we started playing more football, we wanted to develop local football. So the next step was to invent or to develop a local Premier League. This local Premier League officially started in 1973. Since 1973 to now, this local Premier League has produced a wide range of players who have made it locally, players who have gone on to play professionally in England, in America, in Israel, all over the world. Even in the Bundesliga, we have produced players. So, after starting in 1973, we have had many, many winners of the National Premier League. In the early days, Santos was a dominant team along with Boys Town. But based on history, the team that has actually won our National Premier League the most is Portmore United. Now, they weren't always Portmore United. Their first two titles were won under the name Hazard United, but it's the same team. When you check history and you see Hazard United, it is the same team. They were just renamed Portmore United. A couple other teams who have won it 5 times, like Arnett Gardens, Tivoli Gardens, and Santos. These teams have all been teams that were found in the corporate area. As you can see, football is still being dominated by the corporate area. But when it comes to local Premier League, teams in the western end have also had a great deal of success. There was Violet Kickers, Reno, Wadada, and Seba. Back then, Wadada and Seba produced a number of our national players along with Violet Kickers. We're talking about the great names of Paul Teagat Davis, Winston Anglin, Hector Wright, Mark Hagler Wilson, Jim Dandy Graham. These are some players that we find playing football out of the western end of the island and did Jamaica proud in the late 80s to early 90s. Now, the JFF itself came on board with football in 1962. This time, we changed the name from Jamaica Football Association to Jamaica Football Federation. In 1962, we were also accepted into FIFA. This was a big step for football because this was showing that we were now a part of the global picture. While being a part of the global picture, we tried to get to the World Cup. In 1965, we failed, but that wasn't our final attempt. In our attempts to go to the 1970 World Cup, our journey was stopped early, mainly because of indiscipline. 17 of the Jamaican players were banned because of poor behavior. So Jamaica never met their qualification fixtures. Okay? Now, when we're talking about international football, we didn't really start tasting success though till 1991. It was then called the Shell Cup, what we know as the Caribbean Cup. Jamaica won it. Our leading goal scorer back then was Paul Teagat Davis. We beat Trinidad 2-0 in the finals, a game that showed Jamaica bringing out their best. We all relished that moment, and it was the moment we had an international trophy to show as Jamaicans. 2 years later, we performed creditably in the CONCACAF Gold Cup, placing 3rd under the leadership of Coach Carl Brown. Now, Carl Brown was a former national player who became our national senior coach. Carl Brown was the head coach when we won the Caribbean Shell Cup, and he was also the head coach when we qualified for the World Cup. But back then, the head coach wasn't the one who called the final shots, as we will get to in the next moment. In 1994 now, this is when our football took its most significant turn. Our then captain Horace Burrell, he was the president of Jamaica Football Federation. He went and offered René Simoes, the Brazilian, we call him Professor Simoes, he offered him a job to work for the Jamaica Football Federation. At this time, René Simoes came to Jamaica and he brought with him a different flavor to our football, which then changed things for us. So Captain Burrell, even though he wasn't the coach, being the administrator, he was credited with creating this change because by bringing Simoes here, he changed the flow and landscape of Jamaican football.
And Whitmore! Theodore Whitmore. And after Japan had had the majority of the play and the pressure, it is the Reggae Boys who take the lead.
Now, as we can see, Jamaica has had many presidents ruling over our football since we became independent. The list is very long, but Captain Burrell is the feature on this list. Not just the fact that he served twice, but the fact that he was the leader of Jamaican football when we made it to the World Cup. When we saw our greatest glory days, Captain Burrell was the one in charge of football. Captain Burrell took us from where was our lowest point and took us to our highest point in international football. When Captain Burrell took us to our highest point, the main catalyst behind Captain Burrell was our Brazilian René Simoes. René Simoes is a short Brazilian who he really introduced us to professional football. He professionalized our mindset, our approach, and made us believe that the greatest things were possible. We often thought it was just a wild dream to play at the World Cup, but with René Simoes as our technical director, it became a reality. Since 1994 when he came here, what he kept doing, he kept taking the local players overseas, introducing them, exposing them, until the players actually believed that it was possible. Now, while René Simoes did this, what happened is we pulled the interest of Jamaican footballers who were playing overseas. So we had the introduction of Paul Hall, Fitzroy Simpson, and Dion Burton. Those were our three first international footballers who were originated in England but came back and represented Jamaica, and all three of them were very instrumental in our final round of World Cup qualifiers to take us to France. Now, going to France was a great moment because it was the first a country from the English-speaking Caribbean have made this step. And this helped us to raise our standard and our standing in world football. Now, Robert Fitzgerald Earl, we know him as a prominent sports broadcaster for NBC Sports. That's where most young people know Robbie Earl from. But what a lot of young people don't know, he scored Jamaica's very first goal at the World Cup. Robbie Earl was playing in England at the time, but he was one of them that came back and represented the country where his parents and grandparents were from. Robbie Earl being a part of the team, his attitude, he had a very professional attitude, a very workmanlike attitude, and that helped us to do well. It helped to rub off some of that attitude on our local base players. While being at the World Cup, our three games were games that we performed creditably well in. In the first game, Croatia was a top 10 ranked team in the world, and they beat us 3-1. Robbie Earl was the scorer of that goal, giving his iconic salute when he scored that goal. We lost 5-0 when we played against Argentina. 3 goals from Batistuta, 2 goals from Ortega, destroyed Jamaica that day. But it's a day we remembered because we matched skills with the best of the best in the world. And in our final World Cup game, with 2 goals coming from Theodore Tapper Whitmore, our current head coach.
And Japan have gone absent without leave. This is Whitmore. Hall and Gale both available. It's still Whitmore. And it's now 2-0. And possibly the most unlikely looking footballer in the entire World Cup has scored both the Jamaican goals. At first appearances, he does little more than lollop around.
Jamaica beat Japan 2-1, and left the World Cup with our heads being held high as a small country going to the World Cup and doing well. Jamaica has made many great moves in football. Our worst moment was in 2008 when we fell to 116 in our rankings. This is a very disappointing moment because exactly 10 years before that, we were ranked at 27 coming out of the World Cup. After the World Cup, because we had a good run, we climbed the tables and went very high, and because of this, we earned a lot of respect within the region. So, in the Gold Cup now, the Gold Cup, Jamaica has been doing very good in the Gold Cup. From our very first appearance when we made the semi-finals and finished third, to now, we have put in some very creditable performances. Our very best year was in 2015. In 2015, we made it to the finals where we lost 3-1 to Mexico. On our way to the finals, it is a point of note that we beat the United States of America 2-0 in the semi-finals. Since then, in 2017 and 2019, we have been back to the semi-finals of the Gold Cup where we also played well. Now, as we wrap up football history, let's just take a quick look at some of our more prominent players. Some players that have helped to shape the landscape of Jamaica football. Now, Jamaica's first professional footballer that we have on record is Lindy De La Pena. Most people know him because of his years as a sports broadcaster. But a lot of people don't know that Lindy De La Pena was actually one of the better players playing in the English Premier League. It was not called the English Premier League at the time. But Lindy De La Pena, he played most of his career for Middlesbrough. He is actually remembered in as a Middlesbrough legend. When they released their book a few years ago, Lindy De La Pena was remembered as one of the Middlesbrough legends. Lindy De La Pena, he represented Jamaica football well. He made us very proud. And he wore the Jamaican flag wherever he went. Lindy, he played through many appearances, and he was constantly a goal scorer. And a few years, he was the leading goal scorer. He was their leading goal scorer from 1951 to 1952, and 1953 to 1954, the 1955 to the 1956 seasons. He scored a total of 93 goals for them, playing in their FA Cups and other tournaments. He made his move to Mansfield Town in June 1958. He made 115 appearances, again scoring 27 goals. Lindy then came back to Jamaica when he retired and began his career as a sports broadcaster for the then JBC television. Now, a name many Jamaicans don't know is Gil Heron. Now, why is this a point of note? Because of his achievement. He was the very first black player to play for Celtic. You may see Celtic in the Scottish Premier League. A Jamaican, Gil Heron, was the first black player to wear the Celtic jersey. Back then in the 50s, we know racism was very high and not many black players got opportunities, especially from smaller countries. But Heron was so outstanding that a Scottish team was willing to take the risk with him. He was then called the Black Arrow. He made his debut in August 18, 1951 in the League Cup tie against Martin at Celtic, scoring one of the 2 goals in Celtic's victory. Now, our local folk hero, Alan Skill Cole. You hear Jamaicans always talk about it. When you hear football say, skill like Skill Cole, this is the person we talk about. Now, Alan Skill Cole is a boy. He grew up in Central Kingston. He grew up in some of the tougher neighborhoods. He started his high school days at Kingston College. He left Kingston College and went to Campion. Campion back then was a private school. He then left Campion and went to Vertech. And it was at Vertech that we saw his footballing prowess being blossoming. Now, while at Ver, he scored 38 goals in his first season as a 15-year-old. Now, this was remarkable because this led him to being our youngest international. He moved from a little 15-year-old schoolboy to making his debut for the national senior team at the end of that same schoolboy season. This was in 1965. Now, it was awesome for a 15-year-old to be making his debut, but he made his debut not just against any team, but it was one of the Brazilian select teams that was touring Jamaica at the time. Cole had a very short professional career. He played a little time in the US for the Atlanta Chiefs, and then he went to Brazil. Now, while in Brazil, Skill Cole was highly rated. He was a high-performing player in Brazil. While being in Brazil, that was when a lot of Brazilians got introduced to Bob Marley's music, because Alan Skill Cole was also a very good friend of Bob Marley. He and Bob Marley had a very good relationship. He was also a Rastafarian like Bob Marley. So Alan Skill Cole brought our Jamaican culture to Brazil. And in his short time in Brazil, he made a big impact. Now, Skill Cole, when he finished playing, he came back to Jamaica and took up a job as road manager for his friend Bob Marley for a short period of time. He also took up a coaching stint in the 80s in Ethiopia. Yes, Alan Skill Cole coached the Ethiopian national team for 3 years. Now, from the late 80s to the early 90s, anybody who watched football in Jamaica would know who was our most dominant forward was. And that was, by far, Paul Teagat Davis. Now, Paul Teagat Davis, we know him right now as a coach. He now coaches Mount Pleasant in St. Anne. But Paul Teagat Davis made his name and walked in the hearts of Jamaicans being an outstanding footballer. Not just the fact that he was the one that scored the goals for us to win the Caribbean Cup in 1991, but in the early days of our qualification, Paul Teagat Davis was instrumental in the Jamaica national team making it to the final round to qualify for the World Cup. There were games when Paul Teagat Davis, being what they call the old man on the team, was the scorer in some important games, helping us to qualify for the final round of World Cup qualification. Now, Paul Teagat Davis is one of the Jamaicans who took our flag overseas. So after leaving high school, where he played for Police National, he started playing for SEBA. It was at SEBA that he really made his name as a footballer. Then he left SEBA and went and played 2 stints in Israel. Now, while being in Israel, he was one of the leading goal scorers in Israel. Then he left Israel and came back to Jamaica, and where he started playing for SEBA again. While playing for SEBA in Jamaica, he again reminded us that he was the best local striker that we had. Now, the last top player we'll be looking at is Theodore Whitmore. Now, Theodore Whitmore, he played for local clubs Violet Kickers and SEBA United. Now, Violet Kickers in the late 80s to early 90s was one of the dominant football teams in Jamaica. It was one of our better teams, and when Violet Kickers made it to the finals of our National Premier League, they did it with a lot of young players. Back then, Theodore Whitmore was playing for Jamaica under 23 team. And then he made the transfer from Violet Kickers to play for SEBA, and he also was invited to Jamaica senior team. Now, after making his debut in 1993 for the Jamaica senior team, he never looked back. From then, he was a fixture in our national senior team. He was one of our better players, and he was a crucial part of us qualifying for a World Cup in 1998. Now, when we qualified for World Cup in 1998, Theodore Whitmore, being a regular homegrown talent, was one of them that took us all the way, meaning he was one of them that showed a lot of professionalism, a lot of heart, a lot of grit. And after doing this, a lot of our local players began believing it was possible, because they saw a local boy like Whitmore, an average boy from Montego Bay, going all the way, not just making it to the World Cup, but scoring 2 goals in a World Cup game, which by itself is a great feat, but also going professional after the World Cup. Now, his international career went further after the World Cup, like I said, when he was drafted to play in the English League. When he went to England, he started playing for Hull City. He then moved to the Scottish team, Livingston, before signing for Tranmere Rovers back in England. Now, another Jamaican that followed him to Tranmere Rovers was Ian Pepe Goodison. Another Jamaican that was in England at the time was also Walter Boyd. We all remember Walter Boyd was also another crucial player in our qualifications, but because of behavioral problems, it affected his run. But we cannot discount his impact in Jamaica football at the time. He made a transfer to Swansea and started out very good, but after run-ins with the coach and management, Walter Boyd, his career then took a negative turn. He came back and played the rest of his career locally for Arnett Gardens and Harbourview Football Club. So that's it for today. We went through some of our local football history. I hope you learned some things that you didn't know before, and it's just to open your mind so there's more for you to go find out for yourself. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your day.